Majority rules. I think that's a phrase that we're all familiar with, and one that we generally say, hey, that sounds good, when we're trying to make decisions in a group setting, be it, on a team or as a country. And I think that majority rules is also the phrase that we kind of use as the down and dirty way to explain how democracy should work. We all go to the polls, we vote, and whatever gets the most votes wins. Now, what's unique about American democracy, as Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt point out in their book, Tyranny of the Minority, in America, majorities don't actually rule. In America, sometimes less votes wins. In trying to understand this, I think it's better to get out of the abstract and let's give some quick examples of how we see this reflected in each of the three branches of the US government, okay? In the executive branch, if we want an example of how majorities don't really rule, all we have to look at is how we pick our president through the Electoral College. The United States is the only country in the world that elects a president through an electoral college. And the significance of that is that the Electoral College lets someone who gets less votes can still win the presidency. In this case, it's the person that won a minority vote that can still become the president. And this is one example in which majorities don't exactly rule in the United States, how we pick our president. In the legislative branch, let's look at the US Senate. And specifically, we're going to talk about the filibuster. So just some initial groundwork, the Senate, the upper house of Congress, it's made up of 100 senators. Every state gets 2 senators. And in the US Senate, in order to pass laws, it's commonly understood that you need 60 votes to pass any piece of legislation. I think they call it the 60-vote rule. Now just think about that. You need 60 votes to pass legislation. If majority ruled in the US Senate, you would only need 51 senators to vote yes in order to pass a legislation. But that's not the case because in the United States Senate, majorities don't actually rule. In this case, you need a super majority. Now, just to give in just a quick, in a nutshell, reason where this 60 rule comes from, the filibuster is a tool that you can use to delay voting on any bill or legislation. If anyone wants to filibuster, in the old days, you used to stand on the podium for hours on hours to delay voting. Now you just need to send an email. And this is why we call the filibuster costless. So as soon as any senator sends an email that says, hey, I'm going to filibuster this bill, that automatically means you need at least 60 senators to vote in order to end the filibuster and then make Senate vote on that actual piece of legislation. Again, here majorities don't rule when you need a supermajority to pass any form of legislation. Now, in the judicial branch, what's an example there? Well, the judicial branch in and of itself is called the counter-majoritarian branch. Why is that? It's because a panel of 9 justices who are unelected, right? They're nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate. So 9 unelected officials can take a law that was passed by a majority of Americans in a state or in the nation. They can look at that law and say, no, us 9 people, we're going to decide you cannot pass that kind of law. All right? Now, kind of tying all of these 3 things together, when we talk about judicial appointments, it could be the case that you get a Supreme Court justice who was nominated by a president that lost the popular vote and confirmed by a Senate that represents only a fraction of the United States population. To note here, in order to have a Senate majority, it could be the case that that majority only represents less than 20% of the US population. And it could be the case that you get a Supreme Court justice who is nominated by someone that got less votes and confirmed by people who represent only a tiny fraction of the United States population. And in these ways is how we kind of start to see how majorities don't really rule in the United States. And here we might pause. Okay, we live in a system in which less votes wins. Less votes wins, less votes wins. The majority, it's not going to happen because you need a supermajority in this case. And we have 9 unelected officials that are, telling us what laws we can and cannot pass. So in this way, our democracy is filled with instances in which majorities don't actually rule. But we might pause here and ask ourselves, is that such a bad thing? You might reflect on your own American experience and say, hey, if this is the way that, we run our presidential elections or we run the Senate or whatever, maybe that's an okay system, in your eyes or in the eyes of others. And here we might say, in answering the question, is minority rule so bad? Levitsky and Ziblatt, they do concede that there are instances in which we might want minority rule to govern the day. And just to give a quick example, I'd like you to imagine that you live in a state that passes a law that says you must do the Pledge of Allegiance. And if you fail to do the Pledge of Allegiance, you're a criminal. Now, I think that a lot of Americans, in hearing that example, would be like, oh, no, I don't know. That seems to violate my rights. And that is what the role of the United States Supreme Court has in defending civil liberties. When it comes to defending civil liberties, we might be okay with 9 unelected officials telling the government, in the words of the late Antonin Scalia, hey, government, there are some laws you cannot pass. The Pledge of Allegiance case is an actual case that took place, and the plaintiffs in that case were students who didn't want to pledge allegiance to the flag because of their religious beliefs. That was a case in which the Supreme Court came in and said, hey, government, you cannot compel the Pledge of Allegiance of your citizens. That goes against their constitutional civil liberties. Other contexts that you may be familiar with is laws saying that you can't marry someone of a different race. These are the infamous anti-miscegenation laws that were taken up in Loving v. Virginia, famous Supreme Court case, where the Supreme Court says, no, government, you cannot pass a law telling people they cannot marry someone from a different race. And a third example, I think a classic one that many are familiar with, is segregated schools. Brown v. Board of Education said, no, states, you cannot pass laws that say we're going to separate the races in our educational systems. In each one of these cases, the Supreme Court, 9 unelected officials, came in and exerted their minority rule to overturn laws that were passed by the majority, but I think many of us would say we're okay with them doing that, right? So minority rule, not so bad all the time, but in other instances, it may be. Ziblatt and Levitsky, they concede, even though we may be okay with minority rule protecting civil liberties, when it comes to how we run our elections, including how we elect our president, or how we pass laws, for instance, passing laws through the US Senate, these are instances where majorities should rule. If we talk about democracy, most people would say when it comes to elections and passing laws, majorities should rule. We shouldn't let small factions of individuals control the fate of the majority. So, just to kind of tie the bow here in terms of, well, if this is what minority rule looks like in the United States, what might it look like if we actually adopted more of a majority rules mindset in these institutions? Well, when it comes to the Electoral College, we could abolish it. We could get rid of this system where the loser becomes president and institute what all other democracies in the world do, which is direct popular vote for president. You count every single vote, and whoever gets the most votes always wins. We have a video covering Jesse Wegman's book, Let the People Pick the President, in which we take on this topic more specifically, and we'll link that below for those that are interested. When it comes to the US Senate, what might making it more aligned with majority rules look like? Well, let's look at the filibuster. Right now, you need 60 senators to vote in order to break a filibuster. That means that even if you have 51, 55, or even 59 senators, and mind you, with 100 senators in the US Senate, 51 is a majority, 55 is a majority, 59 is a majority of senators. But nonetheless, because of the way that the filibuster is set up, where you need 60 votes to overcome the filibuster and get to a vote, it doesn't matter if these people want to vote yes on the bill. If you can't get past the 60, majority does not rule. So what if we revisit that 60 rule, and what if we made it a simple majority rule? What if you only needed 51 senators to break a filibuster rather than a supermajority of 60? That's one way in which we can make the US Senate a little bit more in line with this concept, majority rules. Lastly, with the Supreme Court, we've had instances in which we see the Supreme Court passing laws that we think, yes, that we protect us. Well, there are instances where many people disagree with what the Supreme Court decides. And one thing that we might consider, we are the only country that has lifetime appointments for our Supreme Court justices. What that enables is the insulation of these justices within the Supreme Court, and they don't become responsive to the majority opinions or anything like that. And that could be a form of entrenchment of minority rule. So what might we do? You may find yourself in a situation in which you have a Supreme Court majority and you want a bunch of them out, but they're there for life. They're there until they're, rickety and bless them, but they're going to be there until they're old and until they die. That's how our Supreme Court operates. Well, one way we can address that and sort of soften the entrenchment of that minority rule, we can do what every single US state, except for Rhode Island, does with their state Supreme Courts, which is implement some kind of term limit or retirement age for Supreme Court justices. I think the average time spent on the bench for a Supreme Court justice is like 25, 30 years, which is a long time, which spans generations. By instituting some kind of term limit or retirement age, we can do what I believe it was Chief Justice John Roberts, before he became Chief Justice, he was actually a proponent of term limits in the Supreme Court, suggesting that if we impose term limits and limit the amount of time spent on the bench for Supreme Court justices, we can get justices that are more in line and more responsive and attuned with what the American populace believes and would like to see the Supreme Court stand for. So that's what it looks like if we were to kind of tweak and adjust our system so that minority rule doesn't rule the day, majority rules. Now, if there's one thing in this discussion that I think that, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt would like to sort of get us to understand, it's that we may think that making these kinds of changes, that's crazy. This is how the US is. This is what our Constitution says. This is how it should be. And even if, someone might concede, okay, maybe that is a better way to do things, it would be impossible to get done. I think that the hope that Levitsky and Ziblatt try to offer us is to remind us that things that seemed impossible once are the rule of the day today. There was a time when abolishing slavery in America seemed impossible. There was a time where getting the vote for women seemed impossible. There was a time where passing legislation such as the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act, which is, many agree, the time when America finally met a minimum level of universal suffrage. There was a time when all of that seemed impossible. Yet, here we are today. And just to close, on that note, some of our most famous founding fathers agreed with that message that Levitsky and Ziblatt would like us to remember. When it comes to this idea that the Constitution shouldn't be touched because it's in many ways people revere it as a almost sort of near perfect document from on high a little bit. To that, Thomas Jefferson was very critical of people who, quote, look at constitutions with sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. He warned against feeling that way about our Constitution. And in the words of George Washington, this notion that, what the founders created was something of brilliant design that shouldn't be altered. He wrote, the warmest friends and best supporters the Constitution has do not contend that it is free from imperfections, that the American people can, as they will have the advantage of experience on their side, decide with as much propriety on the alterations and amendments which are necessary as ourselves. I do not think we are more inspired, have more wisdom, or possess more virtue than those who will come after us. Speaking today, I think that we do have experience on our side. And in discussing all the ways in which we've seen our American democracy play out, and identifying ways in which we might tweak it to make it a little better for all of us. I think that's a discussion that Stephen Levitsky, Daniel Ziblatt would like us to have, in line with the hopes that George Washington and many other founding fathers had, which is that we will continue to improve upon what we've done in the past, and will exercise our constitutional rights to make the changes necessary for our democracy. I think that is a good amount to sit on, and we appreciate you, and you... I don't know how to close these things. Thank you. We appreciate your time, and we'll see you next time. Good night.